On the 18th of August, 2026, the clock in Ottawa was running out. In less than 24 hours, a 50% tariff wall was set to slam shut on billions of dollars of Canadian exports to the United States. Dairy, lumber, cement, hockey sticks, beer. The list read less like a trade policy and more like an inventory of everyday Canadian life, and it was about to get more expensive to sell almost all of it south of the border. This is the story of how that deadline came to be, why Prime Minister Mark Carney has spent the past several weeks walking what more than one journalist has called a political tightrope, and what is actually verified about a trade standoff that some headlines are already calling Donald Trump's biggest setback in North America. Before we get to that claim, we need to get to the facts, because in this story, the facts alone are dramatic enough. To understand the deadline hanging over Ottawa this week, you have to go back to January 2025, when Donald Trump returned to the White House and almost immediately turned his attention to America's northern neighbor. Within his first weeks back in office, Trump began floating tariffs on Canadian goods under the banner of national security, citing fentanyl trafficking and border security concerns. Even though Canada accounts for a tiny fraction of fentanyl seized at U.S. borders compared to the southern border, he also revived a talking point from his first term with new intensity, repeatedly suggesting that Canada would be better off as the 51st American state. For a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, and for whom the United States is by far the largest trading partner, this was not received as a joke. It landed as a threat to sovereignty, and it changed the trajectory of Canadian politics almost overnight. That shift in mood arrived at a pivotal moment. Justin Trudeau, worn down by years of falling approval ratings, announced his resignation as Liberal leader in January 2025. The party turned to Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, a technocrat with no prior elected office but with a reputation for steering economies through crises. Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025. Weeks later, he called a snap election, and the campaign that followed was fought almost entirely in the shadow of Trump's tariff threats and his talk of annexation. Carney's Liberals ran on a message that became a national slogan: elbows up, a hockey term for bracing to absorb a hit and hit back. In April 2025, Carney won that election, turning what had looked like a near-certain conservative victory just months earlier into a Liberal government built almost entirely on the promise to stand up to Washington. That promise was tested almost immediately, and it has been tested every month since. Trump's early tariffs targeted steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, a national security provision that lets a U.S. president impose duties on imports deemed a threat to domestic industry. These are not new industries to this kind of dispute. Canada and the United States have fought over softwood lumber for decades, dating back to disputes in the 1980s and 90s, and steel and aluminum tariffs were also a flashpoint during Trump's first term in 2018. What made this round different was the scale, and the fact that it was bundled with existential political rhetoric about Canadian sovereignty rather than treated as a narrow trade dispute. Ottawa did not sit still. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own on American goods throughout the spring of 2025, a tit-for-tat pattern that economists on both sides of the border warned would raise prices for consumers in both countries. But Carney also tried to draw a distinction between defiance and self-harm. In June 2025, his government rescinded a digital services tax that had been a major irritant to Washington, a tax that would have hit large American technology firms operating in Canada in what was widely read as a goodwill gesture meant to restart stalled negotiations. Days later, at the G7 summit hosted in Kananaskis, Alberta, Carney and Trump met face-to-face and, according to a statement from the Prime Minister's office, agreed to pursue a trade deal within 30 days. It was the first time either side had put a concrete deadline on ending the dispute. Trump, for his part, told reporters around that time that he believed the two countries could work something out. That 30-day window came and went without a deal. By late July, both leaders were signaling that an agreement was unlikely to be reached by their self-imposed deadline. Carney told reporters that negotiations might not conclude on schedule, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, one of the loudest provincial voices in this fight, said publicly that Canada should not roll over, framing the standoff as a fight Canada intended to win one way or another. On August the 1st, 2026, Trump followed through on part of his threat. He signed an executive order raising tariffs on Canadian imports not covered by the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA, from 25% to 35%. That increase alone reshaped costs for thousands of Canadian exporters overnight, and it was the clearest signal yet that Washington was prepared to escalate rather than de-escalate while talks continued. Then came the sharper threat. In proclamations issued in July, Trump laid out plans for 50% tariffs on a specific basket of Canadian goods, covering roughly 5% of Canada's total exports to the United States, by 2025 estimates worth an estimated $20 billion. The list is oddly specific and, for ordinary Canadians, oddly personal. Cement, plywood, hockey sticks, beer, dairy products, and other consumer and industrial goods. The deadline for those 50% tariffs to take effect was set for August the 19th, 2026, which is why, as this script is being recorded, the countdown clock in Ottawa has nearly hit zero. What happened in the weeks between that announcement and today has been a slow, grinding negotiation carried out largely behind closed doors, punctuated by brief public comments from Carney that revealed just enough to keep Canadians informed without tipping Ottawa's hand to Washington. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, along with Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, held a series of meetings with United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer over the past several weeks. According to CBC News, one of those meetings, held on a Monday in mid-August, ran roughly an hour and 45 minutes, described by a source with direct knowledge of the talks as expected to be the final meeting at the ministerial level, though it remained unclear afterward whether that was still the case. LeBlanc and Charette also met separately with Greer and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick that same day, in what was described as the longest session of the negotiating process so far. Carney has been careful, almost deliberately vague, about what is actually on the table. Speaking in French during an announcement in St. John's, Newfoundland, where he unveiled a hydroelectric energy agreement between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador, Carney said the negotiations were delicate and intense, and that this was not the time to bargain in public. He added that Canada was entering the talks from what he called a position of strength, pointing to energy resources and industrial capacity spread across provinces including Newfoundland and Quebec. According to CBC News, when asked directly whether his government would offer financial assistance to affected businesses or respond with reciprocal tariffs if the 50% duties take effect, Carney said he had a plan that would cover, in his words, all eventualities. That phrase, all eventualities, is doing a lot of work in this story because it captures where things stand as of today. There is no confirmed deal. There is no confirmed capitulation by either side. What is confirmed is that both governments are negotiating up against a hard deadline, that the framework being discussed would see Washington scale back both the threatened 50% tariffs and some of the existing Section 232 duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, and that, in exchange, Canada would be expected to remove some of its own retaliatory tariffs and make additional concessions, according to people familiar with the discussions, cited by Bloomberg and TT News. Those sources spoke on condition of anonymity because the negotiations are ongoing and sensitive, which is a standard and important caveat. This is reported detail from people close to the talks, not an official confirmed agreement, and any final deal still requires Trump's personal sign-off. There is also a report, denied by two government sources speaking to CBC News, that Canada and the United States were discussing steel and aluminum export quotas as one mechanism to lower tariffs in those sectors, an idea originally floated by the Globe and Mail citing multiple sources. Two separate government sources told CBC that this does not reflect the current state of negotiations. We are flagging that discrepancy directly because it is exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened into a confident headline when it is, in reality, contested and unconfirmed. So where does the framing in this story's title come from, the idea that Carney has delivered Trump's biggest setback? It is worth being honest about this because overstating a win helps no one and misunderstands the moment. As of today, August the 18th, there is no finalized trade agreement, no confirmed American retreat, and no official declaration of victory from Ottawa. What is verifiable is something narrower and, in some ways, more interesting. A full year and a half into an economic pressure campaign explicitly designed to bend Canada toward American terms, potentially even toward the idea of statehood floated by Trump himself, Canada has neither collapsed nor capitulated. Carney has held to a single public line since a meeting with provincial premiers roughly a year ago, repeated in English and in French ever since. Canada will not accept a bad deal. Whether history eventually judges the coming 48 hours as Trump's biggest setback depends entirely on what is signed, or not signed, in the hours after this deadline passes, and we do not yet know that outcome. What we can measure right now is exposure, and the exposure runs in both directions. For Canada, the stakes are enormous. Trade with the United States touches an estimated 2.6 million Canadian jobs, according to figures cited by conservative trade critic Shuvaloy Majumdar. Ontario's steel and aluminum sector has already absorbed real damage. Algoma Steel, a major Ontario producer, announced plans to lay off 1,000 workers as tariff pressure squeezed its export markets, a decision the local steelworkers union publicly vowed to fight. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has repeatedly framed the dispute in blunt terms, telling reporters Canada would keep fighting every single day rather than back down. Ottawa's political class, unusually for a country with sharp partisan divides, has largely stayed unified on this file. Majumdar, speaking for the Conservative opposition, issued a statement describing Canada as tired of being treated as what he called a punching bag, while also expressing hope that Carney could still secure what Majumdar termed a genuine win at the negotiating table. That kind of cross-party alignment, an opposition critic essentially rooting for the sitting prime minister to succeed in a foreign negotiation, tells you how seriously Ottawa is treating this deadline. For the United States, the exposure is different but not trivial. Canada is one of America's largest single trading partners, and the two economies are deeply integrated, particularly in autos, energy, and industrial materials, where components can cross the border multiple times during a single manufacturing process before a finished product ever reaches a consumer. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum raise input costs for American manufacturers who rely on that supply chain, a dynamic that U.S. industry groups have flagged repeatedly since the first round of Section 232 tariffs were imposed. Higher tariffs on Canadian lumber can filter into U.S. housing and construction costs. And a full trade rupture with a neighbor that shares the longest border in the world is not cost-free for Washington, even if the political rhetoric around it plays well domestically. It's also worth understanding who Mark Carney is, because his background shapes how he has approached this fight. Before entering politics, Carney spent years as one of the most respected central bankers in the world, running the Bank of Canada during the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and later becoming the first non-British governor of the Bank of England, where he navigated the uncertainty surrounding Brexit. That resume is part of why Canadian voters, in the middle of an economic threat from their largest trading partner, turn to a technocrat with no prior electoral experience rather than a career politician. Carney's public style reflects that background. Measured, deliberately unemotional in public settings, allergic to negotiating through the media. When he told reporters this week that talks were delicate and intense, using almost identical language in successive appearances, that repetition was not an accident. It was message discipline from someone who spent a career understanding how markets and counterparties react to public statements. Carney has also used symbolic language deliberately. According to the Epoch Times, he has said he plans to explain the phrase maîtres chez nous to Trump directly, a French expression meaning masters in our own home, a phrase with deep roots in Quebec's history of asserting economic and political independence. Carney has used it repeatedly throughout this dispute as shorthand for Canadian sovereignty over its own economic decisions, and reportedly intends to offer it to Trump almost as a lesson in how Canadians understand this moment. It is a small detail, but it captures something important about how this negotiation is being fought, not only over tariff percentages, but over the underlying question of whether Canada negotiates as an equal or as a junior partner, being pressured toward absorption. There's one more piece of this story that rarely makes it into the ministerial readouts, and it comes not from Ottawa, but from ordinary Canadian households. Within days of Trump's first tariffs taking effect in February 2025, a grassroots Buy Canadian movement took shape almost spontaneously. In British Columbia, liquor stores pulled American whiskey off their shelves entirely. According to CBC News, provincial governments across the country announced measures barring American companies from bidding on public contracts and removing U.S. alcohol from store shelves, while then Prime Minister Trudeau publicly urged citizens to buy Canadian and reconsider vacations in the United States. A poll by Halifax-based Narrative Research found 3/4 of Canadians had changed at least one purchasing habit, specifically because of the tariff threats. A separate survey of over 1,500 Canadians by the polling firm Legger, reported by the Toronto Sun, found 81% said they had significantly increased how much Canadian-made product they were buying. That shift in household behavior was not just symbolic. According to statistics, Canada figures cited by CBC News, imports of fresh orange juice from the United States into Canada fell to $7.45 million Canadian dollars in September of 2025, down from $12.6 million the same month a year earlier, a decline experts told CBC was compounded by the ongoing consumer preference for Canadian alternatives, even after some retaliatory tariffs were lifted. Reuters reported that the effects reached specific American businesses directly. The California drinks company GT's Living Foods said major retailers, including Walmart, had scaled back orders because of tariff-driven uncertainty, while Mark Crames, chief executive of the Pennsylvania-based Demeter Fragrances, told Reuters his company scrapped plans to expand into the Canadian market entirely, describing the shift in Canadian sentiment away from American products as making the effort no longer worthwhile. On the other side of that same ledger, Canadian companies reported gains. Jason McAllister, a vice president at Canadian diaper brand Irving Personal Care, told Reuters that weekly shipments of the company's products had quadrupled. Grocery chain Loblaws, which operates more than 2,400 stores across the country, began marking domestically made products with a bright red maple leaf specifically to help the Buy Canadian movement find them faster. Economists caution against reading too much into any single one of these data points. Andre Kerman, an economics professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, told the Globe and Mail that the scale of this disruption, however real, does not compare to a true supply shock, drawing a contrast with, for example, a country actually closing a strategic global choke point. But the aggregate picture, even by that more cautious economist's own account, still points to a meaningful and sustained shift of Canadian consumer spending away from American goods, a shift that shows up in our cross-border travel numbers, in import statistics, and in the balance sheets of specific companies on both sides of the border, months after the original February tariffs and well into the standoff still playing out in Ottawa this week. Let's talk about the sequence of dates one more time, because the pacing of this story matters and it is easy to lose track of it. February and March of 2025. Trump's early tariff threats and 51st state comments begin reshaping Canadian politics. March 2025, Carney becomes Prime Minister. April 2025, Carney wins a national election fought almost entirely on standing up to Washington. Through the spring and summer of 2025, rounds of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs on both sides. June 2025, Canada rescinds its digital services tax as a goodwill gesture. Days later, Carney and Trump agree at the G7 in Kananaskis to pursue a deal within 30 days, late July 2025. That 30-day deadline passes without an agreement. August 1st, 2025. Canada removes retaliatory tariffs on American goods compliant with CUSMA, another de-escalatory step from Ottawa's side, effective the following month. Through the rest of 2025 and into 2026, intermittent threats, including Trump publicly floating what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer in December. July 2026, Trump issues proclamations threatening 50% tariffs on a specific list of Canadian goods effective August 19th. August 1st, 2026, Trump raises the general tariff rate on non-CUSMA Canadian goods from 25% to 35%. Early to mid-August 2026, intensive closed-door negotiations between LeBlanc, Charette, Greer, and Lutnick, with Carney periodically surfacing to describe the talks as delicate without revealing specifics. And now, August 18th, 2026, one day before the deadline, with no confirmed resolution. Notice something about that timeline. It is not a story of one side, simply rejecting the other and walking away, which is what a title like Canada Rejects USA might suggest if taken literally. It is a story of 18 months of alternating pressure and de-escalation, concession and retaliation, deadline and extension. Canada removed tariffs when it calculated doing so might restart talks. The United States raised tariffs when it calculated Ottawa needed more pressure. Both governments have, at various points, offered exactly the kind of goodwill gesture that gets described afterward as either weakness or wisdom depending on which side of the border you are standing on. That is what real trade negotiations between deeply intertwined economies actually look like, and it rarely resembles the clean, decisive final showdown that a punchy headline promises. So what happens next? As of this recording, the framework reportedly being discussed, according to people familiar with the talks cited by Bloomberg and the Transport Topics Wire, would have Washington step back from the looming 50% tariffs and reduce some of the existing Section 232 duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. In exchange, Canada would be expected to remove additional retaliatory measures beyond the CUSMA-compliant rollback it already made last year, and reportedly to address other American demands that have not been fully detailed publicly, described in some reporting as involving the return of certain American products or measures to Canadian markets. Disputes remain unresolved specifically around automotive market access, steel and aluminum quotas, and Canada's supply management system for dairy, a politically sensitive program that protects Canadian dairy farmers through production quotas and import controls, and which multiple Canadian officials, including a source referenced by BNN Bloomberg, have said needs to be preserved given how many jobs in the agricultural sector already depend on it. Any final agreement requires Trump's personal approval, which is itself a reminder of how much of this process, even after weeks of technical negotiation between ministers and trade representatives, ultimately comes down to a decision made by one person in Washington. Carney has said he expects to speak with Trump directly before the deadline passes, describing it as an opportunity for what he called a good. Discussion about the opportunities the two countries share, a notably warmer phrase than delicate and intense, suggesting Carney is trying to keep a genuine door open for a negotiated landing, even as he prepares contingencies if that landing doesn't happen. United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, for his part, said following the most recent round of talks that both Trump and Carney would now be presented with what he called options. language that suggests the technical negotiating teams have done as much as they can, and the decision is moving up to the two leaders themselves. It's worth pausing here to underline exactly what is not confirmed, because that matters as much as what is. It is not confirmed that a final deal will be reached by the August 19th deadline. It is not confirmed which specific concessions, if any, Canada has agreed to make beyond the steps already taken publicly. It is not confirmed that the steel and aluminum export quota idea reported by the Globe and Mail is actually part of the current negotiating framework, since two Canadian government sources have directly disputed that characterization to CBC News. And it is not confirmed, despite the framing in some headlines, that this standoff represents a settled historic defeat for Trump or a settled historic victory for Carney. What is confirmed is that Canada has resisted 18 months of escalating economic pressure without folding into the kind of one-sided deal that would validate the 51st state rhetoric that started this entire chapter. And that alone is a significant, verifiable story, even without the extra drama layered on top of it by a punchier title. There's a broader pattern here worth stepping back to see. Trump's approach to Canada in this term has mirrored, in some ways, his broader trade strategy toward multiple countries simultaneously. Set an aggressive deadline, apply tariffs as leverage, then negotiate down from that maximum position. Analysts have noted this pattern extends well beyond Canada, and Canada's experience of alternating threats and rollbacks is not unique in that sense. What is somewhat unique is the added layer of sovereignty rhetoric, the repeated references to Canada as a future American state, which transformed what might otherwise have been a fairly conventional industrial tariff dispute into something Canadians across the political spectrum experienced as a threat to national identity. That is arguably the real reason this story generates the kind of intense domestic unity in Ottawa that a purely economic dispute over steel quotas never would. When conservative critics and a liberal prime minister are, for once, saying largely the same thing in public that tells you the threat is being read as existential rather than merely economic. It's also worth noting how this fits into the broader life of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement itself. CUSMA, which replaced the old NAFTA framework during Trump's first term and came into force on July 1st, 2020, includes a built-in sunset mechanism unusual for a major trade deal, a mandatory joint review every 6 years, with the three parties required to confirm whether they want to extend the agreement for another 16 years, out to 2042. If any one of Canada, the United States, or Mexico declines to confirm that extension, the review process instead becomes annual for the remainder of the agreement's term, which would otherwise run until 2036. The first mandatory review fell due on July 1st, 2026, precisely as this tariff standoff was reaching its most intense phase, according to Global Affairs Canada. This is not a coincidence of timing so much as a structural feature of CUSMA itself, deliberately designed to force a political reckoning on North American trade every few years, rather than letting the agreement run on autopilot indefinitely. To prepare for that review, Carney's government formally launched an advisory committee on Canada-U.S. economic relations. On April the 21st, 2026, chaired by Dominic LeBlanc, bringing together industry leaders and stakeholders to help shape Ottawa's negotiating priorities. Trilateral officials from Canada, the United States, and Mexico held their formal joint review meeting on July the 1st in the context of that review process. And Global Affairs Canada confirmed afterward that the underlying agreement remains fully in force until 2036, regardless of how the review itself concludes. When the advisory committee met again in Ottawa on July the 15th, LeBlanc and Martin Moen, chair of Canada's own Trade and Economic Task Force, briefed members on that trilateral meeting and specifically flagged the sectoral tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber as an ongoing challenge to be worked through alongside the broader CUSMA process, according to a Global Affairs Canada statement. On the American side, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office submitted its own 2026 National Trade Estimate report to Trump and to Congress on March the 31st, laying out Washington's list of grievances about market access and trade practices it associates with Canada, a document that trade analysts at PwC Canada have said is likely to shape what the United States prioritizes throughout the review. The Bank of Canada has been watching this same process closely, not as a political actor, but as the institution responsible for forecasting how it will hit the Canadian economy. In its January 2026 Monetary Policy Report, the central bank explicitly named the CUSMA review as a major source of uncertainty for its economic outlook, laying out a range of possible outcomes. In the central bank's base case projection, CUSMA is extended with only limited changes for a new 16-year term, preserving the current, relatively stable regime that Canadian exporters and their integrated supply chains have built themselves around. But the Bank of Canada also modeled a less favorable scenario, warning that if the review produces a significantly renegotiated and more restrictive agreement, it would weaken the competitiveness of Canadian exports, reduce export volumes, and push exporters facing weaker American demand to cut back on production, investment, and hiring. That is, in plain terms, a central bank quietly telling Canadians that the outcome of these tariff negotiations and the broader CUSMA review is not just a political story, but a direct input into how many Canadians keep their jobs over the next several years. Section 232 tariffs, the ones targeting steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber that sit at the center of the current 50% tariff threat, occupy an awkward position relative to all of this. They technically sit outside CUSMA's normal tariff-free provisions because they're justified by Washington on national security grounds, rather than ordinary trade terms, which is precisely why they've proven so difficult to resolve through the usual CUSMA channels, and instead require this separate high-stakes bilateral track running in parallel between LeBlanc, Charette, Greer, and Lutnick, even as the larger CUSMA joint review grinds forward on its own 6-month multi-session timeline in the background. As we close, here is what this script has relied on, and where the honest gaps remain. Reporting on the timeline of tariff announcements, the August 1st increase to 35%, and the looming 50% tariffs effective August 19th comes from CBC News, Bloomberg, TT News, BNN Bloomberg, and the Epoch Times, all of which have covered the negotiations in real time over recent weeks. Carney's public statements, including his comments in St. John's, his description of the talks as delicate and intense, and his remarks about a plan covering all eventualities, are drawn directly from CBC News reporting on his public appearances. Reported details about the specific framework under discussion, including possible reductions in Section 232 tariffs, in exchange for Canadian concessions, come from people familiar with the matter, cited by Bloomberg and TT News, speaking on condition of anonymity, and should be understood as reported detail rather than confirmed final terms. The disputed claim about steel and aluminum export quotas, originally reported by the Globe and Mail, has been directly contradicted by 2 Canadian government sources speaking to CBC News, and we have flagged that disagreement rather than picking a side. Figures on economic exposure, including the 2.6 million jobs tied to U.S. trade, come from conservative trade critic Shuvaloy Majumdar. And it should be stated clearly, as of the time this script was recorded, no final trade agreement between Canada and the United States had been publicly confirmed, and the outcome of the August 19th deadline remains unknown. That leaves us with an open question rather than a tidy conclusion, which feels appropriate given where things actually stand. Carney built his political career on a promise not to accept a bad deal with Washington, and Trump built his approach to Canada on the belief that maximum pressure eventually produces exactly the deal he wants. Within roughly a day of this recording, we will begin to see which of those 2 bets was closer to correct, or whether, as has happened more than once already in this 18-month standoff, the deadline itself simply gets extended again, while talks continue behind closed doors in Ottawa and Washington. What do you think happens when that deadline hits? A last-minute deal, another extension, or Canada actually absorbing 50% tariffs rather than compromising on its terms? Let us know your take in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with an update the moment there's real news to report.